So, welcome. We're going to talk about the Planned Relocation Simulation today, and our session is thought sort of informal training approach. So we are going to talk about how to host a planned relocation simulation, and hopefully, for those of you who already have some concrete ideas of how you might use it with students or with colleagues or as part of your research, we can talk about specifics also. So as and when you'll have questions, we also invite you to explain a little bit about the context in which you're thinking of using the simulation so we can go through some of the um, like actual recommendations that we would give you to make it happen as smoothly as possible. Before we get into the how-to part, I will give a little bit of a short context again, especially for anyone who watches this later on, just so that we're all on the same page as to what the simulation is and what its general purpose is. But then we will focus really on the practicalities. If there's anything you want to ask about, there will be plenty of opportunities. So feel free to raise your hand if anything is unclear. So our goal is for us for you to be able to come out of this conversation, one, knowing if the simulation really is for you and the people you want to work with, and secondly, to have a sense of how you would actually go about organizing it with them. We'll go over a lot of the documents and materials that were provided, and we will share links to where you can find them and download them. We'll explain how you, as an organizer, with or without colleagues, will like play the role of moderator, and yeah, just go through each of the steps basically, just so that you get a real sense of how it all works. Yeah. So I realized actually we didn't prepare slides about the simulation itself, so this because this was covered in some previous conversations, but I will say a few things about it. The first is that our focus then is on planned relocation, which we understand as the collective and coordinated movement of a whole community in anticipation or reaction to disasters or other climate change impacts. And the purpose of the social simulation is to explore the complexities of that process. And we'll get into some of the details of that, but it's really a conversation starter. It's not meant to plan the actual process. It's meant to create a space in which you can have fruitful conversations about that topic and about all of its complexities with the people who participate. So it's not really about providing answers to them about how relocation should happen, but rather create a space where they can themselves engage with some of the challenges, some of the tensions inherent to relocation, and open further conversations on how those might be resolved in their specific context, or if it's for a more educational purpose, just to link it to whatever goals you have in your course.
Okay, so let me take over. I don't know, can you still see my screen?
Yes, we're on the agenda.
Okay, perfect. So David already mentioned some steps that we will take today. We will start with the overview of the documents that are accessible to you. And right now I'm going to send you through chat two of the most important links that might be useful for you as potential future moderator of the planned relocation simulation. With that, I will also share my screen to show you first the website that we've developed and what you can find there. And then later we can take a look at the documents themselves.
You can see the website.
Yes. Okay, perfect. So under Get Started in the menu, you can actually find the materials. So the download link from Zenodo and some promotional flyers that we prepared in case you want to organize session on your own. And as I mentioned, there is a video that we recorded last year that explains a bit more about what's going on in the planned relocation and the goals as a whole of the simulation. In Zenodo, you will be seeing the simple description of the simulation, but if you scroll down, you will also be able to see all the documents that are necessary to organize the session. They are clearly listed. You have documents to print, which are the things that would be good to have during the preparation of the workshop. So, for example, setup list, the visual guide to how to set up the documents, which we will also look at today, observation form preparation checklist. But then there are also some elements that you can use online or on your computer, like a script, a quick start guide, handbook. Those are also printable, but they are also prepared and optimized to be used on your digital screens. And then probably the most important element uploaded to Zenodo is zip with tabletop social simulation materials for print, which contains all the printable cards, maps, and tokens that we will show you later on that are the core of the simulation. Now, we said at the beginning that this is the workshop for moderator, and David already mentioned that you will understand a bit better why, if this planned relocation simulation is good as a tool for your purposes. So let me maybe start explaining a bit what exactly is the role of moderator when it comes to planned relocation simulation. So first and foremost, as a moderator, you need to understand the process that participants are going through. So in short, you need to understand the rules of the game. You don't need to be the expert in the topic, though that's of course good to have this sort of expertise. But first and foremost, you need to understand the rules of the game, and that's one of the topics we will go through today. Secondly, as a moderator, you have to understand how to guide the process. So you need to understand the do's and don'ts of the workshops like this, and to bring it back to the basics. The workshops like this are not designed to tell people how they should be acting in the future, what kind of decisions they have to make in the simulation, but rather give them the space to explore certain possibilities. So rather than telling participants that they have to make certain decisions or pushing them towards certain decisions within the simulation, your task as moderator is to guide them to try and make decisions on their own. You don't need to be expert again in the topic, but being able to answer the questions about the simulation and being able to make the participants comfortable in the situation that might be very uncomfortable, taking into account the topic, is something that would be very important. So as a moderator, you have to make sure that you use open communication, that you understand when people participating are feeling uncomfortable. You have to set out certain ground rules or make sure that participants understand that there is space for the communication and letting you know that something is wrong. One of the big tasks for moderator and for organizer of the simulation like this is actually deciding who to invite and how to organize a workshop like this. So for that, I will give the voice back to David.
So one of the things, just to highlight, I will maybe switch over to that as well, but a lot of what we're talking about is outlined in quite some detail in the simulation handbook. So in there is also like concrete advice on like those do's and don'ts that Michalina was highlighting. But yes, the essential is just to create a space for people to explore. So who are these people that we designed the simulation for? Our primary target audiences, when we were designing this, was we were thinking that this would be a tool that would be used with people who or who are playing or who will play a planning or supporting role in a relocation process or a relocation policy development. But, and this is very important, who may be unfamiliar with the challenges and the complexities involved. So this is the first group of our audience is people who need sort of technical capacity building, who are doing sort of first parts of who are getting to know this topic of plan relocation, who want to share some knowledge across different contexts about plan relocation. And the important thing about this is that because it is a tool that is very open-ended and leaves a lot up to the participants to decide, it is really meant not as a planning tool. It's not something that's the outcome of the workshop is really not supposed to be a concrete, relocation plan or uh, that's much further down the road. This is really just to get that conversation started with those people. The second key group, I think, is students. And we think, I think some of you, that's who you're thinking of using it with. And definitely, we see a lot of potential for this simulation to be used in the sort of classroom. We'll get into details of like how many people you can involve and so on, but definitely anyone in sort of interested in climate impacts, anyone who's doing spatial planning, potentially anyone who's working on communication questions around planning or climate change might be interested in this disaster management. So one thing we haven't designed it with, it doesn't mean that it's entirely impossible to think of a scenario where you would use it with a community, but we did not design it for community engagement. This is in line with the idea that it's for training and not for planning. So the messages embedded in the simulation, while open-ended, are all targeted at getting planners to reflect critically on the kinds of actions that they might take should a relocation process begin. And it also the messages that basically we heard from people affected by relocations or people working with relocating people about what planners should know. So, also, we think that if you use it with community members, you do risk falling a little bit into this question of like, are we engaging in a planning process here? Like, what is the outcome? Like, you risk confusing that a little bit and creating an expectation around relocation. Relocation conversations can be quite tense or difficult because they involve, people's lives, livelihoods, the future of their communities. So we do encourage you to think quite carefully if you do decide to involve anyone directly from communities. Which is not to say that it may not be particularly useful in the process. Finally, I'll also add this, that the workshop is not necessarily intended to be a standalone thing. It's a good conversation starter, which means that it's best used, we think, if you can combine it with some other inputs on the topic of relocation. So with students, that might simply be that it's incorporated in your course and you get another opportunity, maybe the following week, just to talk about some of the themes that are related to the simulation. It's good to really think about how it works into a broader conversation and how people who've experienced the simulation can refer back to some of the things that happened in it, but with other inputs, whether that's, a lecture, a testimony from people who are affected, workshops to actually connect what they discuss to the real world. We've designed it so that it includes something which we call the debriefing, which is a condensed version of that, a conversation within the simulation about what happened, where people take a step back and get an opportunity to talk about the events of the simulation. But just to say that if you can extend that conversation beyond it, whether that's through other conversations in the course or as part of a longer workshop, then that's ideal. And maybe a few practical things then in terms of the audience. This is really designed as an in-person experience. You'll find out also why in terms of like the setup, and it requires a minimum of 11 players to join you. And if you want, you can also extend it to about double of that, because people can be placed in pairs and work together on roles. But there are 11 roles in the simulation. And we'll get into some of the details of that also. And yes, and maybe just to say a final thing about facilitation. If you do it alone, it's possible. I've done it alone several times now. Especially, I did one yesterday with 11 players, and that was perfectly manageable. Once you get into a bigger group, it can become a little bit more complicated, and then it's ideal to have somebody to assist you. And being a moderated team of 2 people makes it a lot easier if you can, although it's manageable alone as well.
Okay, so what do you do when you already know that you want to organize a simulation? You are decided to do that. David already mentioned that you need some sort of facilitation team, or prepare yourself to be the only one. With one person, we recommend max 15 participants, if possible a bit less, but as long as you feel confident in organizing workshop with this size, it should be fine, but make sure that you are up for the task. We also recommend getting some observers if possible. So in the documents that we provided, we also included observation form. This observation form can help you prepare some questions for the debriefing or for the following exercises, as well give us, if you would like to share it, some additional information of what's going on with the simulation and how the simulation itself works within different groups. So the first task is creating some sort of facilitation team. Then we already shared with you the link to Zenodo and to our website. The second big and very important thing to do is actually print out the simulation materials. And what we recommend is full color printing, as we have some color coded materials. If possible, you can use professional printing, print shops. From our experience, one set of materials is around 150 euros, depending on the provider and location, but you can also print it on thinner paper and also print less materials depending on how you are organizing workshop and with whom. We also recommend that you actually take care of printed materials. They are designed in the way that most of them can be reused multiple times during multiple workshops. So you can also let participants know during the workshops that they should be keeping that in mind. As a last resort, you can of course print it in black and white. You can print it home printer, smaller printers. That shouldn't be a problem, but there will be some cutting involved, so be also prepared for that. As with any other workshops, it's good to have some additional materials like markers, pens, and papers, especially if you have observers on the board that would like to take some notes. What helps in keeping everything tidy is envelopes to divide materials, maybe some small boxes or folders to keep some of the smaller materials and make it easier, and lanyards, because as we will see in minutes, there is a lot of involvement from the role-playing side of the simulation, and the lanyards with the IDs that we prepared can help players identify who play who. So this can actually be quite helpful. There is, and maybe we can actually switch to Miro for that. There is some concrete specification that need to be fulfilled so that you can organize session. And first of those requirements is actually size of the venue and what the venue should should include. So first of all, depending on how many people you want to involve, the room that you are using for the simulation should be big enough to accommodate all of them freely walking around. You will also need at least 3 tables with enough chairs to accommodate all of the participants. If possible, it would be good to be able to move them. There is also some things that you can actually make available through projector. So that's nice to have, but it's not necessary to organize. When you have all those things already in place, you can start thinking about how much time you actually need for the session, and how much time the people you want to invite can actually spend on that, because it's crucial that you have at least 3 hours to go through the session itself. But then you will also need some time to actually prepare everything, because there is quite a lot of materials. If you have everything segregated, around 30 to 40 minutes should be enough, especially if you have some support with this part of the preparation. So if there is more people in your facilitation team, that should be much smoother. One thing that is worth mentioning, and that's also general suggestion when it comes to organizing a workshop like this, is sending out the invitation at least 2 weeks before the session, and making it clear what kind of engagement will be required from the participants, because that can be very important, especially in moments the participants come to the room and they realize that they will have to be active. This is the simulation. So when inviting the participants, it's good to let them know exactly what will be expected of them, so that they are not too surprised when they come in. Okay, I think that's it for the general setup of the simulation.
So I just wanted to, before we move on, just conclude on this and say that on the printing and all of these aspects, like, we are available, or I will be available to support you in thinking through like the details if there's any questions. Like, if you do decide and go ahead on organizing it, we can of course be there to have a conversation about, you know, the practicalities, and you're not alone in organizing it. And we also will have some copies of some English language copies of the simulation available initially. So if you're among the first to organize a simulation, we may also be able to simply send you a full package so that you don't have to print it yourself, and that will be a full color, relatively thick paper version that should last you several workshops. And finally, on the time, just from experience, especially if you have a slightly smaller group, it is possible to make it a little bit shorter, but that does take experience. The times that Michalina shared are pretty much the required ones for the first workshop you do. And we realized that, you know, 3 hours can be quite a long time to put people into the room. It does go quickly once you have them in the room, but securing their time can be a challenge. So if that's a concern, it's also, I guess, possible to have a chat about how you might split it up, especially if it's a lower stakes context, like a classroom, having maybe even stretching it over 2 sessions. But that is really not ideal. So if you can have a 3-hour session, that's really the best way to go forward.
Okay, thank you, David. So just to give you a quick overview of what kind of setup we are looking at, I won't be getting too much into details because we will see it in action, but just so you understand what's going on here, I was mentioning 3 tables. We will need a central table where we will have some boards which are used to two separate groups, and then we will have two different tables that will represent different regions that are in the game. So one of the tables is for the community of Mantoa, where we have maps of Mantoa and Mantoa Forest. And the other table will be for Puerto Rico. Both tables will receive some additional materials, such as some instructions, the extract of the Climate Change Act, which provides the setup of the simulation. And then by each table, you will have materials for each of the roles. We've mentioned that there is 11 roles. Each role receives a number of different materials, first being the ID, which is two-sided. On one side, we see the logo of the organization. On the other side, you have the general short game flow, the flow of the workshop, but also the goals and resources that the role will receive to make their decision. Besides that, we also have a bit longer instructions that provide some inputs on the responsibilities, priorities, and attitude to relocation, and also some practical notes and information that will enable participants to understand what kind of role they are playing within the simulation. Then participants also receive actions, which we will discuss later in practice, but those action cards represent the possibilities of what each role can do, and they are quite different between different roles. We also have some roles that receive some additional information in form of maps that can represent different elements within the narration of the simulation. One, for example, being the risk maps that showcase which of the places in different regions are under risk of extreme events. And then also some maps that represent the natural protected areas. Some of the roles will get the tokens, which are all marked with the symbols of the roles. So for example, here we have Council of Elders, and they receive some household tokens that we will hear about in a moment. And then we also have some materials that should be visible throughout the simulation, one being the general game flow of the simulation that showcases each step. This is also information that is received by participants, for example, on their IDs. Then we have markers that actually help us follow what part of the game we are already in, as the game simulation is played in rounds. Those will help us to follow up on that. And then we have a general map of the Mantoa that also should be visible for all of the participants. And I think with that, just to show you, there's quite a lot of materials to be set up. So the tables, so you need to make sure that the tables hold all of them. But then again, the envelopes I mentioned earlier can be very handy in just segregating them, and especially for the materials that participants receive, it's very handy for them to keep them in the envelopes, and this way they don't have to keep everything on tables. So you can also save some space. Okay, David, do you want to take over to...
Great. Also pause just in case there are questions, but yeah, as Michalina mentioned, like you can also think of all of these boxes on the Miro here as essentially envelopes. When you're preparing when you get all the materials, you can just put them as they are presented here into envelopes, and then when you get and place them in front of each of the players. Okay, so Michalina has presented the materials. It might not make full sense just yet as how they all relate to each other, but so now I'm going to explain how we set the scene and the flow of the simulation. So as mentioned, we have two separate tables, which essentially representing two groups of players in different places. On one table, we have the community of Mantoa and the community and the adjoining forest that's a sort of site of ecological and traditional cultural value and significance. Around this table, the players take on roles that are related to the community, so they're different constituencies within the community of Mantoa. I'll get into a little bit into detail, but basically each of them have goals that are slightly different. One of the main messages we heard during the design of the simulation is that communities are not just one entity, they're not homogeneous. Actually, they have different interests within them. And this is what these four roles are meant to represent. And yeah, so they all have slightly different goals and attitudes towards relocation, and they are based together at one table. And then on the other table, we have 6 government actors. Some of them in purple are presented as regional actors, the other ones as national ones. They all have also different responsibilities, different goals, things that they're supposed to achieve institutionally, whether that's ensure the protection of heritage, ensure that there's access to services for all, or the prevention of risk, for example. They, and I'll get a little bit into that in a moment, they are responsible for the whole region, not just the table that they're at where there's Port Orica and then also the community of Ombon. They're also responsible for Mantoa. Also at this table is a second community, the community of Ombona, which faces its own challenges. And in there, we simplified it, and there's only one actor representing them, but they are also there to offer basically maybe a contradiction or another point of focus throughout the simulation. So instead of having the actors focus exclusively on what's happening in Mantoa, which is the prime area that's being considered for relocation, there is a second community, Ombona, which also has needs in terms of access to services, and will be expressing those needs. The player playing that role has to advocate for themselves with the government, and it may also be a place to relocate to that can be negotiated. The way in which we welcome players is initially we don't give them all of the materials; those are in the envelopes in front of them, but we introduce all 4 of these locations as facilitator. You get information. We have a script for this, but basically you just present each of the places. You say that Mantoa has attracted, I'll give you a very brief pitch of it, but basically Mantoa has been hard hit by coastal impacts in recent years. It's attracted a lot of attention in the media and in sort of national policy for that, and it's being considered and discussed as potentially one of the first places in the country that will require relocation. And because of this, the government, as part of a sort of the parliament, as part of a National Climate Change Act, has which covers a lot of different things, has also established a relocation decisions task force and set out a few principles on how relocation should be discussed and approached. And narratively, at the beginning of the workshop, you basically tell the government actors that they are members of this task force. They've been given a few principles, and you can distribute this sheet of paper which has these principles laid out for them, and say that they've committed to this. They've been given this information, but the practicalities and the details of how relocation should go forward and how the case of Mantoa should be addressed is up to them to decide. And you get the government actors to commit, and you can have a little signing moment where you ask them each to sign this declaration to make sure that they've read it and also make it kind of official that they commit to these principles. Having done that, with this little narrative introduction, you just then invite all of the players to open their envelopes and start learning a little bit about their roles. From experience, it takes a little bit of time for people to get acquainted with what it might mean to be, for example, the Department of Social Protection. So they have to read through this quite short but still quite dense piece of information that tells them what their goals are, how much money they have, what kinds of actions they have to do. And they also have to look at their own cards and, get a sense of what might be possible for them to achieve and what kinds of actions they can take. So this takes a little bit of time. In my experience, it's good to give them like 5 to 10 minutes, and you tell them just read them, start talking to each other about what your goals are, exchanging information about what sense you're making of what you're finding. This is also a moment where you get, as a facilitator, quite a lot of questions. People will just ask for clarification, and this is where your knowledge basically of the simulation elements is going to be quite important, just to be able to answer clearly if people have any doubts about certain things, how to interpret certain things. And at that moment, it's also important to just clarify to people that it's very important that they take their goals to heart, that their role is to represent their institution to the best of their ability with the objective of achieving these goals by the end of the simulation. The goals, I will also add, and this is really a design feature, are open to interpretation. So beyond saying take your goals to heart, people might want to know more specifics, but then you just have to tell them it's up to you what that means. What the goal means to you is how you should pursue it. And this is where essentially the fun and the interest of the simulation comes out, because this is where people's interpretations and people's approaches to those goals leads to all kinds of different situations and interactions, which are then the most interesting things to discuss in the debriefing. So this is the beginning of the simulation. And having explained all of this, having people already start exchanging a little bit, talking to each other about what their goals are at their own respective tables, after a moment, you can then go into a first round. We call the round 0. And this is where you get everybody's attention again, and you just walk through how each round would go. And this is quite simple in a way. So the way each round is supposed to go is in 4 steps. The core of it is really just step 1, which is a discussion phase, where people, taking into account the information that they have and the actions that are available to them, simply need to talk to each other, to exchange information, to look at the situation on the boards, and to start making some decisions about what might need to happen. The whole point there is that they just need to have conversations and try to work out what's going on. And usually, so you give them 15 minutes for that. And by the end of those 15 minutes, you just force them to stop talking and just intervene and say, now we're going to take a quick break. You have to take some decisions. Time has been passing. We need to make sure that any decisions you've made in this first step are recorded, that actions are taken. And then you make sure you go through with them any actions that they've decided to take. You record them on the board, and you complete any transactions if there was any money involved. Then you just pose the question to people who are representing community members, and you ask them just to make a statement about what they consider to be the situation, like what the status of their community members is, if they think that the places where they're currently living are sustainable, habitable, meet their needs, and if not, if they're considering relocation or not. And this is also the moment, if it gets to a stage in the game where people want to relocate, this is where you make it happen and you actually physically sort of move households to a new place. And then in the 4th step, you draw cards. So we'll go through what these do in a bit, but basically each table has a stack of opportunity cards and a stack of risk cards. And there you draw, and those are events which will sort of change the balance of what's happening and maybe introduce new possibilities. So the opportunity cards are generally things that people should consider there's a trade-off involved, and the risk cards are usually just causing some sorts of change, damage, coastal events, floods, something like that will put a little bit of pressure into the game and maybe force some new decisions. So you just take people in round 0, you just take them through these 4 steps under your guidance before letting them do it on their own. So you just guide a bit of a conversation, ask the table what it is that they think they should be doing, and then you take 1 or 2 actions as examples and show them how that would happen. And then making sure that people have understood what the sequence of events should be every round. And then once you get a sense that people are more or less understanding of this, you can then just start the simulation, which means that you tell them, okay, now we're going to start round one. You have 15 minutes to start discussing, and people usually just then start having those conversations and engaging with the materials. And I'll say a couple of things about that and from experience. And as you might have gathered from our presentation, the simulation can be quite overwhelming and a little bit confusing for people at the beginning. There's a lot to take in, both in terms of making sure that they understand what it is that they can do, which we've streamlined and people usually get a quick sense of, but also more importantly, getting a sense of what everybody else can do. That's the thing, that's the challenge of the simulation. And so in the first round, people typically take a little bit of time before they really start engaging and conversation really starts to pick up. But we really have observed that usually by the second or third, like by the second round, people are really starting to engage and pick up on certain elements that they were not aware of at the very beginning, that like starts triggering conversations and exchanges and sometimes tensions and conflict around what it is that people should be doing, what the path is for each of the communities.
Quick mention in the handbook, we also provide all the visual guide, how everything should be set up. Everything is also there, so even if you don't join the Miro, those information are also included in the handbook, and of course later we will share the recording of the training.
All right, and I guess my next step is just to take you through a little bit of like our experience of what happens once you get started. So as I said, it's quite a lot to take in, but and people have quite a bit of latitude in how they interpret each of their goals and the information that they've received. So there's quite a strong role-playing element in this game, in the sense that depending on how people interpret their goals, things can go quite very differently. We've had situations, for example, where the community of Mantua, represented by 4 people, would have quite a harmonious relationship, and people would really work together. And immediately, let's say the mayor's office would offer to pool resources, and people would get organized that way. But we've also had situations where people have a bit more of a competitive aspect or take a particular aspect of their goal really to heart. Let's say like the Council of Elders is responsible for ensuring the protection of cultural heritage, and taking this really to heart can lead to conflict with others who might be more focused, for example, the Landless Coalition, on ensuring that the people they're responsible for, who are among the most vulnerable in the community, have access to income and new forms of housing, because they start with the households they're responsible for living displaced in tents and in urgent need of new so you can see the tents here, in urgent needs of new housing. And to reiterate something that Michalina said at the beginning, there's no reason for you to be directing people to a particular interpretation. It's very interesting once you get to the end of the simulation and the debriefing stage, which we'll go into detail about later, but people really start explaining why they interpreted what their role in the way they did. They raise internal sort of conflicts of interpretation, and that is what makes the simulation interesting, is once you get to this stage of people explaining their own actions to others, highlighting how they interpreted things, how there might have been differences between them. So either way, whichever way it goes, it's often interesting. What you do need to do at this point, though, is people may have, as the game starts really rolling, some people may perhaps miss or focus overly much on certain aspects. So a couple of things that do tend to happen, it's happened in several simulations, is that, for example, one of the actors with special information like these maps might ignore them for a while. If you notice that a big element of the simulation is simply being ignored, it might be good at that point to just step in and say, do remember, like, you have this information. I think it's important for you to take it into account to make sure you can meet your goals. Yeah, so there's that would be basically the this information we presented, which is like only available to that actor and should be a helper in deciding what to do. Okay, yeah, and I'll just say it can feel like quite a chaotic experience, and people might have quite a lot of questions, which again is why it's nice to have also have someone to help you so that you can each focus on one of the tables. It's possible to go back and forth between the tables as well. Um, but if you have help and someone can focus on each of them, that's also good, so long as you communicate with each other as well to make sure that you don't say anything that conflicts with whatever the other table is being told. And finally, maybe one thing that we didn't mention and should have a little bit earlier is that the reason we set up the room in this way of separating them is that there is also one crucial rule that's communicated at the beginning, which is that physically moving across the room from one table to the other is not free. People are not allowed to shout across the room to the other table. They have to get up, cross the room to see them. So it's nice to have them quite far apart. And when they do that, they have to pay a price. There is one exception, which is the mayor, who is free to move at no cost. But this is intended to create a bit of a barrier between the two tables that needs to be very consciously overcome. And one of the main differences between the different simulation workshops is how soon that line of communication is established is quite a crucial aspect of the experience for everyone and of the outcomes. So in some simulations, someone on either table will decide very quickly that they have to go and have a conversation on the other side. But in others, they stay separate quite a long time. And again, this is one of those things that you, as a facilitator, have to just stand back and let happen, unless you get to the third round or fourth round and still no one has talked to each other. That might be a moment to maybe nudge in that direction. But it's also fine if it doesn't happen, because that then leads to a lot of interesting conversations at the end about the manner in which people communicate about information that's available to them or not, and also about priorities and goals and so on. And very commonly, and this is one of the most often interesting outcomes of the simulation, is that people have conversations in the debriefing about the manner in which they sort out the opinions of others or not, if they consulted others, if they waited too long, if they were overly focused on maybe one aspect of the simulation to the exclusion of others, and how that can make some people feel ignored or of having their views discounted, for example. And those are the social dynamics that are very interesting and that are actually kind of at the core of the simulation. So I think there's a couple of elements just in response to that. So we have it laid out in writing. I think it's a little bit easier to it's structured maybe a little bit more clearly in this part of the handbook of the different steps, also because it's quite methodical. And the second thing is, even I as a moderator sometimes, like, yeah, I did one yesterday and it gets quite chaotic, and I think that's part of what the design is for, is that people engage, and it becomes kind of impossible to follow everything that's going on because there are lots of conversations, and that's totally fine. I think especially I think, Matt, if you're using this with students, I think the idea is that people engage in conversation and there's like a lot going on. And one of your role as facilitator at some point is just to step back and be like, we'll just let this play out. And sometimes it goes in directions that are unexpected or feel like might be a bit unintended or wrong. But once you get to the debriefing, you just talk about what happened, and that's the point. No, so those are actually the risk and opportunity cards. So at the end of the round, so you have two options. One is just to let it be random, and you just pick the first cards and hand it of each. So we've separated them. There are opportunities for one table, for each of the tables, and risk for each of the table. Just take the top cards on each of those and hand it over. Some of them are basically, especially the opportunity ones, they'll be for a specific player, so you just hand it over to them, and it introduces something new to discuss. I mean, just to give you an example, like this one's often quite popular, like people have quite discussions about this, but the Council of Elders is invited to an international conference, and it might lead to a new opportunity, but it means that one of their households is taken away for the rounds to do that and cannot do anything else. And it's exactly the sort of example of like the point of this is just to stimulate a conversation about it, and people may or may not pick up on it. In some simulations, this really spoke to some of the people I handed it to, and then they had a big conversation about it that in some way wasn't even reflected on the board very much, but was useful for them to discuss. And then the risks are the ones where an effect happens and there's a little narrative description, and often it's enough. You can obviously add a little bit of narrative when you hand it over, but they're designed so that when you give it to them, they can also read into it whatever they want. So it can be, so the phishing, or it can be effects on the board. And those are important because they disrupt the flow of what people might have been planning. And the randomness of it can feel a little bit unrealistic sometimes. So that's fine, I think, usually. But if you feel like you want a slightly more directed experience, you can also sort them or even pick them. Once you get to the end of the round, you can look through them and just pick one out and say, this is going to happen now. If you feel like you need to introduce a bit of pressure, it can be one of those climatic events that causes damage to the community, for example. If you feel like things are going too smoothly, or vice versa, you can give people a little bit of a break if you feel like they're struggling with the situation at hand. From experience, also, people get quite involved in their conversation, and so it's important that you do assert yourself as a facilitator, like periodically at the end of a round, so every sort of 15 minutes or so, to make sure that these opportunities and risks are introduced into the game. So concretely speaking, I guess I'll give some examples from Mentor. Mentor, at the beginning, narratively, we tell them that they've experienced the reason why relocation is being considered is because there's been previous climatic events, and the impact of which is represented by these like damage tokens. And the idea is that if further events happen and damage accumulates, things like housing might be destroyed fully, become uninhabitable, and so on. And so people on the Mentor side have a number of actions which basically allow them to so there's a couple of things. One is that they have actions for work. So each of the community members needs to find some form of income, and within the community currently it's pretty much limited to fishing, and also they can choose to do logging in the forest. And then they have a number of other actions like taking on a service job in the city, which requires them to travel to the city, incorporating the cost. And so people will initially be very focused on, okay, where is everybody working? What are the needs? And then that's when comes up the fact that there's actually not that many opportunities for everyone, that if the community wants to be able to also take care of the people who are living in temporary shelters, or maybe repair some of its housing, they're going to need either more sources of income or more assistance. And then some of them have additional possibilities. For example, like they can build new housing, so just to explain how the cards work, they get like the title of the action up here, and there are a couple of symbols that represents what this is about. So this is about housing, but it's also, because they're traditional houses, it's also about sort of cultural heritage. So anyone who values having a culturally significant in their roles, if they're told, oh, you want to preserve the community's practices and so on, this might be relevant to them. And some of these then have specific limitations, which are indicated by these little exclamation mark gray areas. And so in this case, it's that you can only really build on the place that's where there's space for it. And to do so, the format is always like this, where you have on the left what you need to provide. In this case, you need the time of 2 households for the round, and then that leads to you being able to place the traditional house card on a cleared space to build it. And all of these work like this, essentially, where people have a condition and then a result. So if you do take a service job in the city, you have to place the household on that job for the round, you can get paid for it, but of course you have to pay attention. If that means traveling from Mentor from one table to the other, you have to go there and pay. Maybe to say then give more examples from the other side. On the government side, the actors have different goals and corresponding actions. So the Transport Infrastructure Ministry, for example, can build various kinds of infrastructure, often at quite high costs, and there are often like conditions around that. The risk agency, they have actions that allow them to deal with sort of anticipate risk a little bit more, so they can do some risk assessments and invest in early warning, so that they can actually find out what the risk card is going to be before it happens, and maybe help with some of the planning. There's also a zoning mechanic where they can request for certain areas that they deem too dangerous for future building to be made into no build zones, and to communicate then to other players that these areas should not be constructed on, and they can base this information on these maps, these decisions on these maps in negotiations with others. I guess just to say in general, the interpretation of what the cards mean and what they are is maybe where your role as facilitator is most useful, because people will have questions about, oh, where can I do this? How does this work exactly? What does this symbol mean? That you can usually clear up very quickly, but you need to have a sense of how things work before hosting the simulation, ideally, so that any questions can be resolved quickly when they come. And maybe one more thing is that it can be important to communicate to people that sometimes they look at their card and like, but I can't do this just yet. And then that's an opportunity for you to say or remind them that some actions require collective action, basically, and cooperation. And that if there's something, one sort of stock answer is very much that if there's something that feels like is missing, somebody else probably has it. And that their job is also to find out how to implement something with others, because maybe something that they need doesn't exist yet, but might be something that somebody else can provide. And again, if you do decide to use the simulation, I'll be very happy to also have bilateral calls with you once you've had a chance to read the handbook, answer any questions that you have. We can also have a call and discuss any of the elements. We're aware that it can feel quite complicated, but from experience, it's also just quite an engaging process. People, once you get started and the simulation starts rolling, things have always gone well so far. The challenge we find is more in actually just getting people into the room and getting everything ready. Once you have the simulation going, people have, at the very least, have a good time, and usually a very engaging one as well on the topic. Please do reach out if you're interested in using it after you've read the handbook. I'd love to have a conversation about how effective it is as a tool for you to get started, basically.
Great.
And if there's anything we should change or add to.
Okay, are there any other questions on that? If not, I think we could bring it back to the briefing very shortly and follow up. Oh,
Yes.
okay. Any questions? Just checking, just in case. I think there are no more questions, at least not about this part. So we talked a lot about the briefing being essential because the simulation itself is not a tool that can bring much understanding or concrete next steps. That's what the briefing is there for. That's why it should be essential to have at least short discussion after the simulation, because it's there to help you make sense of the experience and for participants to somehow connect it with the real world and see also what are the similarities and differences of the debriefing. What's important to note is also that it might be very difficult for you to go from the simulation to the briefing, because depending on the participants, they may not want to start discussion, rather they would like to play more and more, and it might feel like quite an abrupt end for them. So it's also good to let them know beforehand that we will be going into debriefing soon, or maybe frame it as, okay, it's time for the new generation to take over soon, so that they don't feel like the switch to the debriefing is too difficult. What you would like to do for the debriefing is for sure to have the setup that will allow all participants to be able to see each other. So ideally, the chairs that you have there, the space that you have there will allow you to, for example, create some sort of circle so that you can have the open discussion between all the participants. You can also, if you have a lot of participants, prepare to have smaller groups first, but it's very good to have some sort of plenary discussion during the debriefing too. If you can, and if it's possible, it's also nice to prepare some photos maybe of how the boards looked like during the game, so that you can compare at the end how it looked at the beginning and how it looked throughout the game, because it might help bring up some situations and also show the progress of the work that participants been doing throughout the workshop. If you can, you could also consider taking some notes to bring in the debriefing. That's why I was also mentioning earlier the observators and the observation protocol that we attached, because again, this may help you with bringing certain steps in the debriefing. We also recommend short breaks before the debriefing, because the simulation is requires a lot of energy from the participants, so they may need something like that, or maybe just allowing everyone to sit down and also bring up some food or something like that will also make it easier for everyone. We usually divide the discussion into 3 parts, and that's also the case. That's also the case for the planned relocation simulation. We first address the emotions, then discuss lessons learned, and connect it with the real world setting, and then we often also do some feedback on design. But for the specific planned relocation questions, maybe let me give floor again to David so we can look in more details what kind of questions we are actually looking at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in my experience doing this, the first step of addressing emotions can be more or less important. In some cases, people will have gotten quite excited, potentially quite frustrated, and it's very important to like give them an opportunity to express that. Some groups may not have engaged quite as intensely, and then that's also fine. And the conversation around emotion passes quite quickly. But then in the lessons learned, so basically at this stage, we have in the handbook a number of suggested questions, like specifically phrased, that you can use as sort of starting points for each of those steps. But basically, I could also even just show you. Yeah, so in terms of like the lessons learned, the one way of doing it is to progress from events in the simulation to the real world. So you ask people maybe some of the most notable events. If the participants, it's unlikely, but if they don't pick up on anything, you can point out particular moments of maybe tension or big decisions that they seem to have made that you saw during the simulation, and just ask very open-ended question like what was happening there, what was the discussion about, so that people bring up their own interpretations. The important thing here is just to get people to share how they experienced it, also because it's a relatively big group. Even when you have the minimum of 11, someone's perspective from one side of the room about what happened might be completely different from somebody else's on the other side. And it's that exchange of experiences that actually like suddenly might lead people to completely reevaluate what they were thinking about what was actually happening. And this is when people discover also sometimes that there are like bits of information that they completely missed out on or that were like set aside and so on. And that can lead to some interesting conversations. And then in terms of bringing it towards, and this is where, so the conversation, it's in 3 steps, and it's good to try and like keep it to that sequence, but it will naturally sort of flow that way in my experience as well. You get to a point where then you ask people to connect to real world plan relocation things, and then you will have people say what felt or didn't feel realistic usually to them, and maybe lead it to like actual examples. And there it's useful. So typically people will point out to some of the core design stuff that works for them is like the challenges of communication. It's like who gets consulted when, who's involved in decision making, what does it take to be listened to, what are the things that get prioritized over other, like which concerns get prioritized over which other. And every time this goes a little bit differently in each of the simulations, but the conversation often turns around like, what is the relocation, what are the priorities, who gets to decide, and so on. Another thing that tends to happen quite a lot is that this is just a feature of the simulation as it was designed, but there's rarely, in the way we've done it so far, any moment where any like very definite moment where like people collectively decide, okay, we're going to relocate all of these people from one place to the next. The process is a lot messier a lot of the time. It's a lot more gradual, and it leads people to talk about whether or not perhaps they should have had better planning, better anticipation, how you can then go into counterfactual scenarios where it's like, if you had decided much earlier on to do it collectively and move people away from the coast all at once instead of in this gradual manner, how would that have been better? How would you go about it? And then something that we do as the designers is also ask for feedback on the design itself, and you can, as a facilitator, also use that as a way of sort of completing the conversation, which is to say, more broadly, what about the design seem to work for you? Were there things missing? Because then people might bring up certain aspects of relocation that they feel are very important to consider in the real world, which might not have come up in the simulation. That's also a useful conversation. And so you can just also encourage people to be critical of the game itself, of what it contains, maybe to highlight the things that they liked as well, because that's also just the third way of accessing certain lessons about relocation, maybe aspects that weren't featured in the way it was played and so on. And if you feed those back to us, that's also very useful and interesting for us to know, even if we can't necessarily change the game. Yeah, so that's the point of the debriefing. Just to reiterate one last time, it's very important that you do one. And if you can then follow up or like connect it to other conversations later on, that's even better. And one last thing, we've mentioned observers. So as like, in case it wasn't fully clear, like having observers is just another way of including more people into the game, people who won't be active role-playing participants, but will be tasked with just observing what's happening, taking notes, and they can be involved as well in the debriefing and give a slightly exterior, perhaps more holistic view of what happened, with insights into some of the dynamics that are really only visible when you like take a step back and look at the whole room rather than are focused on whatever it is you're doing as a participant. Yeah, and so the handbook has examples of how to approach this process. And then finally, we have a post-simulation survey, which is designed to be very short. It's mostly just ticking boxes. How much do you agree with certain statements? And then a little bit of space to write a more detailed feedback for anyone who wishes to do that. And we appreciate if people who are engaged in simulation do fill it in, because it's very helpful for us also then to evaluate not just what people learn, but also just the simulation as a tool in general. Is it something that works? What are people learning from it, etc. Are things that we're very interested in finding out. Yeah, so the simulation is designed in a way that it's quite flexible in the sense that it's non-geography specific, which allows for it to be used, I think, with quite a diverse set of people, with a couple of caveats. One is that it's quite hard to make it super specific to a particular context. So you have to communicate to your participants that the simulation is inspired by a range of places and it tries to condense lessons from all of these. So the lessons about relocation that are embedded in the game are about common dynamics between stakeholders. The specifics is kind of up to them in the debriefing to connect. So an example of this would be like in our context, we don't face exactly this hazard, but we have a similar dynamic that's happening with this. Or they'll say, in our case, it's actually because the hazard is different, the dynamic is actually quite there's something here that's not reflected in the simulation, and people can express that, and that in itself can be quite useful. And maybe one more thing about that is what I've observed in some of the debriefings is that people will tell stories about things it made them think of. And in a way, the fact that the simulation is not too specific allows people to draw some of these connections and say, okay, we don't have this agency, but I work in like maybe a similar one or something about the way in which this agency works in the simulation reflects a real world experience that I have. It's really never meant to be one-to-one, but elements of it will speak to people, and that's what counts for the debriefing. When you're planning a workshop, a simulation workshop, if you decide to do so, I'll be very happy to work through some of the framing that you would need to do with the audience that you want to work with. We could discuss what important points you would want to present before and then in the debriefing to make sure that they get the most out of it and that the experience speaks to them for that context. Michelle, do you want to add something or?
No, you already mentioned it, but I actually think it's very important to bring the differences between what's in game and what's in the setup that the participants are actually living in. Because the more differences there are, the more you can ask why those differences exist, if they're connected with how the people work with each other, or why certain solutions are not in the context that you are working in, because that can also help them understand their context a bit better through this discussion. So every difference and every mismatch is actually more opportunity to actually discuss that and can actually bring forward certain topics that maybe wouldn't come up if it was one-to-one.
Yeah, and I think also it's important to remember and set expectations that this is a conversation starter. It's something that is meant to bring up interesting dynamics to discuss. Which means that then, I mean, something I've had, for example, yesterday, people judged the way in which they cooperated with each other as completely unrealistic in the sense that they were like, we were much too cooperative for this to reflect the real world, but then that led us to a conversation about the reasons why cooperation is difficult. I mean, so you can make the best out of almost any outcome in a way, so long as you set expectations around it being for the conversation and that like in the debriefing, anything that feels particularly unrealistic is then treated as a reason, like a topic of conversation. Why is it unrealistic? Is it unrealistic because it's just not like reflective of the real world, or is it because it's too aspirational? Because there are other obstacles that get in the way of actually achieving this, but we would like it to be this way. Like a lot of those things can be actually quite productive. Yeah. So I hope that we've provided a good overview of how it works. So one thing about translation, realistically, I mean, it's quite a big task to have all of the materials translated. So that would require quite a lot of lead time, and probably we would need to secure a bit of money to make it happen. Just because we also need then to get the graphic designer at CRS like working. We would need to have a conversation basically about how to make it happen. But Michalina maybe say if you think it's realistic, like we could in theory make it happen.
Yes, in theory, we could make it happen. And even if we do not have budget, we can provide you actually the document with all the materials, with all the texts from the materials, so that if there are any issues with a language, you can at least provide like text-based translations. That's for sure possible for changing materials. Yeah, we would need to look into that, but in theory, that's also possible. We are preparing French version of the simulation, so we also have some experience with the process already.
And the second thing is what we would realistically translate the materials that those participants interact directly with. All of the supporting documentation, the handbook, etc. I don't think it's worth at this stage translating. The amount of effort required would be probably disproportionate. Like the handbook is like 85 pages long. So that's as a facilitator, it's much better if you're comfortable doing it in English and just having the materials be in the other language. But so we should continue that conversation and see how we could make it happen for you. If that's it concerning questions, please feel free to interrupt me if not. I guess we'll conclude here. I hope that you feel more informed about how it works and had a chance now to evaluate whether or not you feel it's something that you could use. We'd love to hear from you once you've had a chance to also dig into the handbook a little bit more. We're available to discuss. We're also available to support. And as mentioned, we will have soon a few printed copies in Bonn. They'll end up in Bonn, but we can send you. We can definitely arrange to send you a copy if you are among the first to organize a simulation. We'll have a few available to save you any of the printing costs and time organizing that. Yeah, with that, thank you very much, and I really look forward to hearing from you, especially in terms of if there's anything that you feel is missing from the information that we provide in terms of actually making it happen. If there's anything else we need to make available for potential facilitators, it would be really great to know. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.